Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, should buying or selling sex be a crime? A recent move by the human rights charity Amnesty International has sparked a big debate. We'll explore what people are saying. Now, if you could see Malika Bilal's laptop, the number of tabs and tweets and Facebook comments and video comments she has, you would be amazed at how she's sitting there with not sweat pouring down her brow.
Not yet, anyway.
Our online community is so ready to have that conversation.
They really are, and sex workers are weighing in on this topic because it affects their lives, and so we're hearing from all of you. I want to share this one comment, though, from someone who gives us the central heart of what a lot of people are saying. He says, "This is one of the oldest professions on earth, and legalized or not, it's thriving. So why not decriminalize it?" That's the topic we're going to talk about today, and whether or not you think we should, you can weigh in with hashtag AJStream.
Hi, my name is Jean. I'm from Zioni, Singapore, and I'm in the stream.
In August, human rights charity Amnesty International met and agreed to work on a policy to protect human rights of sex workers. The idea behind that is to remove abuse and stigma from all aspects of consensual adult sex. After years of collecting the data, 2 years in fact, and anecdotal stories, the organisation said Amnesty urges states to adopt a policy that seeks attainment of the highest possible protection of the human rights of sex workers through measures that include the decriminalisation of sex work. They also urge states to ensure the policy seeks to maximise protection of the full range of human rights, in addition to gender equality, women's rights and non-discrimination related to sex work, in particular security of the person, the rights of children, access to justice, the right to health, the rights of Indigenous peoples and the right to a livelihood. Amnesty International also says that states have an obligation to ensure that sex workers can use criminal law to address acts of exploitation. But opposition has been strong. Critics of Amnesty International's move says that this will inevitably lead to increased human trafficking and more abuse and exploitation, not less. Others argue women will further be exploited if pimps and those who buy sex are not penalised. So what does decriminalised sex work actually mean, and why are some people so opposed to it? Here to help us have this conversation, we have Catherine Murphy, Policy Advisor at Amnesty International. Maxine Dugan is President of the Erotic Service Providers Legal Education and Research Project and is a working prostitute. Simone Watson is Director of the Nordic Model in Australia Coalition and a former prostitute. So it's good to have you here, everybody. Let me start with Maxine. Maxine, in your experience, in your working life, was there a time when you felt that actually if prostitution had been decriminalised, this would have made my life or my colleagues' life a whole lot better? Can you give us an example?
Well, oftentimes people in our community are targeted for violence, and so I've helped many people, co-workers, people who are members of our group to be able to report when they have been victims of rape, robbery, theft, coercion, and extortion. And I can tell you, it is no easy task. The police often do not want to take reports when we are victims of crime. We had a situation actually up in Alaska last summer where a friend was a victim of extortion via email from somebody who posed as a client. And we spent many unpaid hours going to different police agencies, to a prosecutor trying to get immunity for her so that she could report this attempted extortion instead of being charged with being a sex trafficker. We went all the way to the governor of Alaska, and it was only then that he directed the police agency to investigate that, and charges were brought. But it was no easy task. And then for the victim's part, she was then treated quite badly by the police, and she was treated quite badly by the rescue organizations, the police had given her phone number to the rescue organization, and they proceeded to harass her. She had to change her phone number. That case is still being adjudicated right now. There hasn't been a conviction yet. You know, she is still at risk, you know, for exploitation.
Maxine, and do you think that happened
by
particularly because she was a prostitute, and right now in the US, being a prostitute is, in most places, illegal?
Absolutely, and the attempted extorter did state that in the email
Interesting.
clearly.
So Simone, what Maxine was talking about is something we are hearing from other people online. I want to share 2 tweets with you. This is from Stuart, who says he does think that decriminalizing sex work will reduce the violence. He says workers need to feel safe calling police, getting medicine, help, and getting regular sexually transmitted infection tests. Another person writes in about her personal experience. This is Mistress Penelope, who says decriminalization means that I can report stalking, harassment, and abuse before it escalates without endangering myself. So Simone, she's echoing really what Maxine told us earlier. What are your thoughts on what she had to say?
Well, my thoughts on that with the Nordic model, that's a given. If you're selling sex yourself, you're not doing anything illegal whatsoever, and you have access to the police.
Simone, can I
for
just quickly
stigmatisation.
interject, and I'm going to ask you about the Nordic model. It kind of came about back in 1999 when Sweden was working on a bill for violence against women, and they decided that prostitution itself wasn't illegal, but, and then finish the sentence for me.
Well, yeah, but that pimping and buying sex it should be a criminal offence, and it's a violation.
And that became quite a popular idea in Sweden, and then Norway, and then Iceland became known as the Nordic model. Not only that, but there's help for prostitutes to actually get out of prostitution in terms of education and support and social benefits.
Yeah,
so when anybody says the Nordic model, that's what they mean by that. So
that's what they mean, and I agree. I believe that the police should not be harassing anybody, you know, in prostitution who's selling sex, and that they have a right to be free from harassment. And I thought, yeah, this is where I would agree with Maxine and with Catherine, that I think it's reprehensible, and the stigma should not be laid on us, but on those who buy and sell us. Absolutely.
Catherine, let me bring you in.
The issue for me is that this is not decriminalising the prostituted people. This is decriminalising pimping and buying.
All right. So, Catherine, let me bring you into the conversation. The idea of decriminalisation. Sometimes people don't understand it. Sometimes they're thinking, oh, you want to legalise prostitution. Decriminalisation of prostitution. What does that mean as far as you're concerned?
I think there's been a misunderstanding in many quarters of what we mean by decriminalisation of sex work. I think some people think it means the complete removal of all laws, including laws on exploitation and trafficking, and that's not the case. The laws on exploitation are extremely important in a decriminalised system, and coercing anyone, forcing anyone, you know, any kind of coercive action in a decriminalised system needs to still be a crime. However, and it's great to hear, you know, Maxine and Simone and myself, we're all in agreement that sex workers shouldn't be harassed, extorted, bullied, prosecuted by police. The issue that Amnesty International has with the Nordic model is that under the Nordic model, sex workers are still criminalised in a number of ways. And if you let me just explain very quickly why that is. Under sex work laws, it's not just the direct sale of sex which criminalises sex workers. It's not just laws on the direct sale of sex which makes them criminal. It's also laws on organising sex work, on living off the earnings of sex work, brothel keeping, soliciting. In some parts of America, there are crimes known as manifesting prostitution. So just looking like a sex worker is a crime. And in the Nordic countries, living off the earnings of sex work is still a crime. Promotion of sex work is still a crime, and those laws are used against sex workers on a regular basis in Nordic countries. So we are concerned about that.
Maxine, I want to bring you back. Maxine, let me
Living off the earth is pimping, and I think that pimping should definitely be illegal. I don't think that that prostitution should become part of the taxation system and the gross national product. I find it reprehensible. I don't think people should be living off the earnings of other people's prostitution at all. And you can couch that in as much anti-discrimination rhetoric as you like, but if people are profiting from it and governments are taxing it, then to me that's a violation of human rights and quite reprehensible. I think you're quite wrong about that altogether. The research proves that you were wrong, and that sisters that I've spoken to in Sweden and Norway, what they're noticing is rather than an increase in harassment, violence against women generally has decreased. Women are more likely to go to the police because what they're doing is not illegal, and also the buyers are more careful about treating women better because they're already doing something illegal, so they have to be very careful.
Well, I want to share two views on Catherine. I want to share two views on Amnesty's research from our community because, of course, it sparked so much conversation that a lot of is happening online. So this is Rose, who says Amnesty has done its research and listened to sex workers. We know that decriminalization is the safest way. But then you get tweets like this. This is one person who says, why does Amnesty have no strategy to end demand for prostitution? They act as if the majority of prostitution is voluntary. Catherine?
Well, I think that there's a number of different questions in there. I think that if a state or a government wants to reduce the number of people who are doing sex work, I think that's a much more complicated issue than the criminal law, than simply introducing criminal laws. You have to look at migration policies, you have to, allowing people to migrate more freely. You have to look at social policies so that people can access social security. They don't have to rely on sex work just to get by. You have to look at education, employment. You have to look at effective exit programs. I mean, in many countries at the moment, the fact that sex workers have a criminal record makes it very difficult for them to leave sex work and get another job. So I think that the idea that the criminal law is a silver bullet which can reduce sex work is a mistake, and it simplifies a very complex issue.
Maxine, let me just bring you back into the conversation here. In this field, there's a lot of dueling research. If you decriminalise prostitution, yes, there's going to be more trafficking. If you decriminalise prostitution, there'll be less trafficking. In your experience, where do you fall on this debate?
Well, where we fall on the debate is exactly what Amnesty's policy states, which is that everybody has to be decriminalized across the board. Currently the criminalization laws, such as they are, for example, in California, that defines a pimp as anybody living off the earnings of a prostitute, can include people like my adult son, who I'm helping through college. He can be arrested as a pimp. In California now, because of all the additional anti-sex trafficking laws, he will be charged as a sex trafficker and will be eligible to register as a sex offender, which is a lifetime registry in the state of California. And so we really need to get some decriminalization across the board for our whole community. If you have two workers working together in one space under the current criminalization laws, and one worker is attacked in some way and the other worker is a witness to that, you can see that person charged with being a sex trafficker of the other person, and the crimes of rape, robbery, theft, coercion go unaddressed. We have a lawsuit that we filed in federal court against the state of California for violating our constitutional rights with that anti-prostitution law. We've included a client plaintiff in our lawsuit because we need our primary transaction between the client and the worker to be completely decriminalized.
Right.
The clients have to have exactly the same right to negotiate with us, just like we have to have the right to negotiate with them for our labor and our own safe work condition. So we applaud Amnesty for taking on a policy that we have long advocated for.
And Simone, that is a common criticism, the one that Maxine just made. I want to share this tweet with you from Carrie, who says, the Nordic model criminalized anyone who benefits from my sex work labor, including my family who I support. It's much safer if I don't have to worry about the cops arresting me. How could anyone think that criminalizing my clients will help? And she ends by saying, these people who want to criminalize my clients just want to keep me in poverty. Simone?
Well, frankly, I don't believe it. But to get back to what Maxine was saying, she was talking about when prostitution is completely illegal, which again is not the Nordic model system. That would not happen to her.
Right, but what this person on the tweet was talking about was criminalizing the buyer, and this person talked about this penalizes them and their family members. So you said they're incorrect, but can you explain?
How? It's not penalising the family members of anyone in prostitution whatsoever. It is penalising, criminalising the Johns, which is ending demand. And it has to be pointed out that places that have introduced this model are in the highest ranking for gender equality in the world. That violence against women decreases, that there are options for people to leave the industry, and those that choose to stay in it are not stigmatized or punished. We really need a huger allocation of funds to go into that, to support the exiting side of it. And the idea of decriminalizing prostitution across the board for pimps and buyers is offensive, because it is proven that wherever prostitution is fully decriminalized, there is an expansion of trafficking and illegal prostitution by fourfold. That's fact, that's research. As to Amnesty International's
Simone, some of the research also showed that where the Nordic model is working very successfully, trafficking and prostitution just moved to neighbouring countries that weren't quite so strict with the way they were treating prostitution. So there's a lot of research out there and a lot of data, but what I'm really interested in is mining your personal experiences rather than quoting research, because that gives us a little bit more insight and makes an interesting conversation from your experience, because I could just quote that back to you and saying, well, it just got worse in the neighbouring countries, but it was fine for Sweden. Let me just take a pause for a moment and just go back to Catherine, because it's very interesting how you did the research and collected the data, because I think a lot of people, the minute they heard about Amnesty International looking at the human rights aspect of sex workers, people got very, very upset. But in the 2 years, what did you do?
Well, as you say, we've spent 2 years looking at this issue, and we actually had some evidence from reports before that led us to look at this issue. So, for example, we'd done work on torture in Nigeria, where we found that sex workers were among the groups most at risk of torture at the hands of the police. So that was some of the reasons why we looked at this issue. But we spent 2 years. We've spoken to many organizations, many individuals, hundreds of individuals and organizations around the world. Our different country sections have went out and consulted in their countries. We fed all that back. We've redeveloped and developed documentation. We've looked at all the research that exists. And then we also did our own research. We visited 4 countries: Argentina, Hong Kong, Papua New Guinea, and Norway, which has the Nordic model, where we spoke to sex workers, survivors.
Catherine, what did you do when, for instance, Papua New Guinea? What did you do in Papua New Guinea?
Well, we went to Papua New Guinea in January of this year, and we spoke to an enormous array of organizations and individuals, and most importantly, we spoke with the people in Papua New Guinea.
Always happens just when a guest is about to say something really, really critical. We're all leaning forward and it's like, it froze. But Malika, what do you want to add?
I want to bring up this as a
Catherine, we'll get back to you.
Possible alternative. This is from Eddie, who gives us an example from his hometown. He says, it's legal in New Zealand. Now sex workers have the protection of police. A sex worker even won an employment case against her boss. He brings up one example, Maxine. What kind of model would you like to see?
Well, thank you for asking. You know, I agree with Catherine in that decriminalization is a process. It's just the beginning. And in getting all the stakeholders to the center of their own voices is really important. And beyond decriminalization, we're going to have some anti-discrimination legislation so that people who work in the sex industry, people who are buyers, everybody has to have access to some anti-discrimination legislation so that when we do go to speak out, we're not going to be retaliated against and we're not going to be discriminated against in housing, child custody issues. We see legal sector sex industry workers like adult film performers and exotic dancers being discriminated against and taking on some other kinds of employment where they can work in those occupations. And then once it's found out that they have been working, that they are they can be fired. And so, we need some anti-discrimination legislation. It's a really big thing. But don't get me wrong. We don't want to see the Walmart brothel model brought in here to the United States. And that's why it's important to get actual what kinds of any legalization or regulation schemes that go beyond decriminalization.
Sure. Simone, I know that
Can
you're...
I just
Yeah, go ahead. I was just about to come to you. Go ahead. Simone.
Can I just interject on this idea of the research that Amnesty International has been doing and also address New Zealand? Decriminalisation of prostitution in New Zealand has been noted as a failure. There's been a 100% increase in street prostitution. There's been a rise in the level of violence against women in indoor prostitution, and the situation has been considered highly regrettable.
Simone, you made this point really strongly. What would you suggest, Simone? What would you suggest? Let's push forward a little bit because we understand where you're coming from perfectly. What would you suggest?
I realise that people are asking me not to talk about research, but they're quoting research at me. The research done by Amnesty International is about as unbiased as a mining company's environmental impact report. The research that they got was sent out in forms of questionnaires to brothel owners who call themselves sex workers, much the same as Maxine Dugan does.
Simone, hold tight for a moment. Simone, hold tight for a moment. Because I actually want to keep...
That is absolutely not true statement.
Right. So this is a good point. This is a good point to say Catherine Murphy, who's back with us, Maxine Dugan and Simone Watson. We're about to get into a very heavy part of the conversation. I want to take that conversation in its entirety to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com because there's a lot of unpacking that we have to do with that. Meanwhile, let me just see what's been going on online with our online community.
Of so many really interesting tweets and a couple of debates happening, but I wanted to share this video comment from someone who weighs in about the central issue, she says, which is human rights. So have a listen to Kate.
Decriminalization of the sex trade is an important step towards respecting the rights and well-being of people in the sex trade, including trafficking victims. Criminalizing prostitution creates a target population for violence and exploitation. Criminalizing everyone around that person leads to isolation and vulnerability. After years of being a community organizer for folks trading sex, and now as a national policy advocate at the Sex Workers Project, I applaud Amnesty International's decision to embrace human rights for this community.
But if you listen to this conversation we've just had here, how representative of what you were seeing online?
I would say it's pretty split down the middle because for every tweet that you had backing up what Kate said, that they support this, you had other people saying, at the end of the day, we need to make sure that prostitution isn't something that continues.
Right. Interesting. All right, so we have, still in our conversation, Catherine Murphy. Catherine is the policy advisor for Amnesty International. We have Maxine Dugan. She is the president of the Erotic Service Providers Legal Education and Research Project. And we also have Simone Watson, who is director of the Nordic Model in Australia Coalition. The conversation is just about to get started. There's a lot of debate to have, and we're going to take it online at stream.aljazeera.com. So you have to go from your TV onto your laptop if you're not already there. We will continue this episode of The Stream online. Hope to see you there. Thanks for watching. All right, so we're back online with Catherine and Maxine and Simone. And I didn't mean to cut you off, Simone. I just wanted to feel like we had to have this conversation in its entirety, not halfway through as we were heading to the end of the show.
Sure.
Right, so this is interesting. This amnesty idea of having a policy which is looking at the human rights of sex workers, it absolutely caused a big storm. Part of that is some of the things that Simone wanted to talk about. Let me just check in though with Catherine first of all, Simone, and then we can come back to you. Catherine, were you I mean, it's just saying we're going to be developing a policy. Why do people get so upset about the idea of developing a policy, do you think?
I think there are really strongly held views on this issue. I think people often feel very emotional about it. I think they feel very passionately about it, and we knew that, and we took this issue very, very seriously. We weren't blasé, we weren't cavalier. We took our time and did an unprecedented amount of research in terms of developing this policy.
All right. So I know, Simone, you have questions for Catherine. Make them genuine questions. Don't make them, I heard this or I saw this, but really genuine questions. So I'm not feeling like, oh, you have an agenda here. Of course you have a take, but what are the genuine questions you would like to ask Catherine?
Well, I'd like to ask Catherine, why then in the policy as it stands now, you not only have the decriminalisation of pimping and buying, but you actually are leaving governments, countries and states with the right to discriminate and legislate against the person selling sex. It seems completely counterintuitive. We wouldn't have this under the Nordic model. So why is that section 13 of your policy? And how does this help women?
I don't think that's what our policy says. I think that we've taken this issue extremely seriously, and yeah, well, if you, I mean, that's fine if you can explain it to me why you've interpreted it that way.
Well, how do you interpret this? States can impose legitimate restrictions on the sale of sexual services. That would mean that a state or a country can tell a so-called sex worker to move on or criminalise her if they disagree with it. So I don't understand how that policy...
what the resolution acknowledges is that in different countries we do understand that there will be regulations on sex work. There will be some regulations around health and safety, etc., and that we expect the state to ensure that sex workers are safe in what they do, and that's what that part of the policy acknowledges, and I think that our arguments around pimping, as you call it, and buyers relate to our direct research findings in Norway, which is a country which has the Nordic model, where we found that sex workers were still being harassed by police, and in many instances street-based sex workers were being aggressively pursued by the police and were being evicted from their homes. So we went to Norway, we did our research, and we found that the Nordic model was still leading to the same problems for sex workers who were criminalised, and that's why we needed to look at laws on buying and laws on third party or operational aspects of sex work. We needed to look at all of the laws.
All right. Guess I hear all of your different... Simone,
I'd like to jump in here
Simone
for a
and
minute.
Maxine and Catherine, hold tight for a minute. I hear all of your points. Maxine, what do you want to add? Because we haven't heard as much from you. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's really important, to point out that Amnesty, went and talked to the actual workers who are suffering under the model that criminalizes the buyers, and those workers have, adamantly spoke out against that model, that it does not work for the workers to have the buyers criminalized, that it puts the workers in the situation of having to protect the buyers. Because they are criminalized. They can't be caught buying. So that forces the transaction and the worker into spaces that are not
You've just lost a little bit of Maxine. Simone, there are a couple of different organisations, not just, sorry Maxine, we've lost a little bit of your audio. Hopefully we can get you back just to say, wrap up the conversation. Simone, there are a couple of other organisations like the World Health Organization, UNAIDS. Amnesty is pretty much the last big organisation to talk about this idea of decriminalising prostitution. Every time you hear of another one, what's your response to that?
Oh, well, yeah, well, I could go into the infiltration of the pro-prostitution lobby into UNAIDS and the World Health Organization. Also, I'd just like to go back to that point about, you know, people actually talking to sex workers and going to Norway.
Yeah.
Anyone in a sex worker union can call themselves a sex worker, from the brothel owner to the taxi driver. In some cases, even the John calls himself a sex worker. Maxine calls herself a sex worker when she's actually in a management position and has been convicted of
that's not a true statement. That is absolutely not a true statement, Simone.
All right,
that is
so
a false.
At this point, I feel this is a good point, guests, to wrap up, because once we start,
and this name calling is unacceptable. This name calling is unacceptable.
Right.
It's unacceptable.
Okay.
I'm not going to put up with it.
Maxine, Simone, Catherine,
it's absolutely unacceptable.
it is unacceptable.
No.
We don't have name calling on this in this conversation. I told you it was going to be a
Thank
dinner
you.
party, a metaphorical
Not
dinner
name
party,
calling, it's a
round
job
at my
description.
house. And I think this is really important, because courtesy, even when we have very, very different views, is really important. So we're almost out of time. So Simone and Maxine and Catherine, I really hear all the points you made. You made them really well and very strongly, so people can hear the debate that's going on around decriminalisation. Malika, what do you have for us?
Well, Femi, we ended the main portion of the show with the video comment from someone who supports Amnesty's proposal policy. This is someone on the other side, and there are lots of more tweets where this came from. This is Heather, who shared her thoughts with the stream.
It is utterly naive to think that decriminalisation will contribute to women's human rights. It will not ultimately protect prostituted women from the terrible abuse they suffer. The first premise of decriminalisation is men's alleged right to buy women's bodies. One day, I hope that we'll look back at our society and wonder how we could propose, as a human right, the right to buy and sell girls and women.
So both guests talking about human rights there, and I know that that will spark a whole other debate, which we'll be looking out for with hashtag AJStream.
Yes, I literally have about a minute between all of you. I'm really interested in you giving us a final thought on this conversation. If people are watching this conversation are thinking, I just heard Catherine, she makes sense. I just heard Maxine, she makes sense. I just heard Simone, she makes sense too. If they're just sitting there trying to think, okay, what's the takeaway that you can give me from this conversation? Maxine, just in a sentence, what's your takeaway for us today?
Well, that you have to put the actual workers at the center of their own voices, that's really the primary thing that has to be done. And that's what the amnesty policy and our policy is about. So yeah, thanks for hearing me.
Simone, your takeaway?
My takeaway is that I'd like people to remember that this policy was drafted by a UK brothel owner called Douglas Fox, and that
All right,
Amnesty
Simone,
claimed to have
Simone, as far as I know, this is not
Excuse
true.
me, let me finish, please.
No, Simone,
Amnesty International
as far as I
did not
understand, this
consult
is
the
not
survivors
true.
and
So then
abolition
you
groups.
wasted your final thought, which I'm really sorry about there. Catherine Murphy, what's your final thought for us?
Femi, just to clarify, I was one of the people who was involved in the writing of this policy,
Sure.
so I can testify to that.
Yeah.
Just as a takeaway, I think our policy is about protection of the human rights of sex workers, and how do we protect people who are often in a very marginalised, vulnerable situation. And we don't think that criminalising them and criminalising the context in which they live their lives helps them in any constructive way. So we have to do something different. We have to change this. This is not good enough as a society. So we have to try and work for human rights.
This is always going to be a contentious issue. I really appreciate you bringing it to us and talking about it today. Catherine Murphy, Maxine Dugan and Simone Watson, thank you so much for spending time on the stream today. Take care, everybody.